thank you for inviting me and yeah, generous introduction and for I totally agree. It's been so fun to work on that project together, and I think part of what led to that was really the interest in this area from an undergraduate student at Northwestern, Carolyn Zhu, who is now incoming doctoral student here in the Stanford HCI program. And actually this work features a lot of stuff that emerged through their honors thesis work at Northwestern. So I implicated them in the talk. I don't think they're going to be joining us for the talk today. They are sleeping off an overnight flight after coming back from Kai. This really builds off of and extends a lot of the stuff that they developed in their honors thesis, and that's really kind of brought me into this space in a way that I really appreciate. So thanks to Carolyn for that. Also, Michael mentioned my colleague Benjamin Mako-Hill at the University of Washington. Mako also contributed some funding support through a REU supplement to an NSF award that supported some of Carolyn's work on this, so I want to acknowledge that. And this work has been heavily influenced by the work going on through that I'm collaborating on with Michael, which is being led by June Park here, and involves a number of other folks. But now that I've thanked all those people, I want to withdraw any responsibility from them for what follows, and just any errors of judgment or mistakes or things like that are mine. In part because this is pretty new work. So hot off the presses results that we're still figuring out what to do with. And so I'm really looking forward to feedback and questions, because it all turns into grist for the mill for what do I do next. And so apologies in advance if it's very rough, if it's very unpolished, if I don't know what I'm talking about. I actually love giving talks like that because it means it's sort of live problems for me, and I can enlist you as collaborators and conspirators along the way. So with that, Michael mentioned our lab group, so I don't have to say a lot more about that, but I did just want to mention it as context because a lot of our work does not look like the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. And one member of the lab who's implicated in that picture is also here today, so Hyun Wong. But there's a thread that runs through some of the stuff that I think Michael mentioned that was work initially in crowd work and crowdsourcing platforms a while ago, where that connects to what this is about and that connects to some other work in the lab group. And if you want to learn more about the lab group, that's our URL at the top of the slide, and I'll put it up again at the end. But and we're always interested to hear from folks who are interested in learning more about what we're doing. So please get in touch. But the thread that runs through from some prior work was really trying to understand, think about crowdsourcing workers as a potential data source or sample or population within which social scientific research could be conducted. Today, now in 2024, that sounds arcane and archaic because it's basically, one, it's not clear that things like Mechanical Turk and other crowd work platforms are going to be sort of, survive the transition to generative AI systems very well. I can talk more about that later if you want. But B, because there was a lot of early research that basically established ways of thinking about sampling bias, adjustments, validity, and inference techniques that could help resolve some of the variations between crowd work samples for social scientific insights and other kinds of samples and populations that you might want to draw. So this is an HCI course, so before I start talking too much about samples and sampling, I should just preface that by saying, for social scientists, right, and there's a kind of big part of my training and brain that's oriented towards the social sciences, a major concern about developing and testing theories and understanding behavior is thinking about who you're conducting the tests among, or what population you're trying to talk about, right? If I'm interested in saying humans do something, sort of in a certain way, well, in theory, I have to evaluate that in some way that can generalize from the sample of people I talk about or I conduct the study on to the bigger population of humans writ large. In the work that I do, it's very rare that I'm actually interested in trying to generalize to humans. Oftentimes, I'm doing work that's more interested in specific kinds of online community contexts or online platforms, but it's still important to understand the biases and variations that may distinguish the groups in those settings from other parts of the population, whether that's for the purposes of understanding who's there and who's not, right? Things like participation gaps and digital inequalities, or if it's for the purposes of understanding what's driving the selection in or out of those environments, right? So that's all kind of context. This particular project is really trying to understand how LLMs may be used to advance social scientific inquiry and sort of to simulate and understand human behavior more broadly. So the question is really not, like at this point, I think we're sort of in the early days of this area of research. There's been a rapid sort of flurry of work that I'll talk a little bit about in a moment that's still sort of probing and trying to figure out what's going on and how to use generative models to understand human behavior and simulate human behavior more effectively. And to do so in ways that can be applied to behavioral sciences, social sciences, and a variety of other domains. But this is an active sort of design challenge and an inference challenge, right? So the inference challenge is more of that social science concern I was talking about a minute ago, right? Social scientists want to understand, like, what are the problems with this kind of, like, how do you generalize from robots to human populations or samples? But it's a design challenge too, because a lot of the models and the interfaces for interacting with them are not set up to support this particular kind of use case. And the tooling or the standards or norms around how to do that effectively are not established at all, right? This is not the world of running experiments on Mechanical Turk or Prolific or whatever your favorite online sampling system is. This is a very new domain. So it's that challenge that I want to try to focus on, and that's the setting for this work. So as I mentioned, there's a really rapidly growing area of work in this space. And I think it was inspired and sort of provoked in part by work like this, which, at least I'll speak for myself here. Personally, when I read this paper, my collaborators and I got very excited because we were like, whoa, we could test theories about social interactions and individual level behavior and emergent collective behavior in these kinds of AI systems that we might not be able to evaluate among real live people. So as is often the case, we were jumping about 30 steps ahead of what was reasonably possible at the time. But since then, this has kind of moved on in various ways, and some other folks have made some really wonderful steps in the direction of evaluating what generative agents and generative models can simulate effectively of human behavior, right? This is a working paper that John Horton put out a little over a year ago now. But there have been more, and a number of them have been published in various places. And at this point, there's quite a lot of stuff. And most of the papers, right, you can sort of notice there's something funny about this paper, which is very common in a lot of these, and it's this question mark. Right, a lot of the papers still have question marks in the title, like, can we do this with generative AI? Like, will it work? How well does it work? They don't know. They're being polite. They're beating around the bush. They all think it can work. Otherwise, they wouldn't be investing all the effort that they are in trying to get it to go. But what I think it indicates is that there's a lot of excitement among social scientists, right, to become a distinct subset of end users of AI systems. And what a lot of this work is doing is sort of probing with different kinds of replication strategies. How can I reproduce social scientific findings or benchmark the performance of various, prompting strategies with generative AI systems against human behavior from various kinds of contexts. So there's also a growing kind of area of work in this space that's trying to talk about some of the challenges, both the opportunities and the challenges, being more reflective about this more generally, right? This paper was published, last week by Chris Bale in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. and it talks a little bit about some of the concerns and problems and issues in this space, right? And the published and preprint studies in this area are increasingly acknowledging things like that they may not be able to replicate even the results of what they're producing when they're prompting AIs to perform behavioral tasks, right? A lot of the initial studies were run on versions of GPT that are deprecated, where the prompts weren't published alongside the initial studies in ways that you could sort of like track the provenance of how the results were elicited. And so there are different kinds of like lurking problems in a lot of the data and a lot of the prompting that's been used to generate these early stage social science findings. And I can trot out a small pile of examples, but I think that the pattern here is that there's often some attempt to do some kind of like to demonstrate both that the findings have validity, which is the primary concern, like that the findings that they're getting out of the models are replicating some human benchmark, as well as to say, oh yeah, and here's what we asked the model, how we asked the model, here's some of the different versions that we tried, right? So it's kind of a bit of a hodgepodge at this point. But people like Chris Bale and Michael Frank in the psychology department here have been very articulate about some of these concerns. And if you're interested in reading more about it, I recommend their work. And some of the studies that have come out, right? This is one that I particularly like that tries to use language models to simulate human samples for kind of public opinion research in political science, led by Lisa Argyle at BYU. Some of the work has really tried to embrace really I'll just say sort of like admirable standards of transparency and reproducibility and providing the sort of prompting materials and all of the inputs that they use to generate the resulting social science kind of benchmarking analyses that they're performing. Including things like multiple versions of prompts, variations of different ways of sort of tuning the models or hyperparameter settings that they may have configured in the context of generating their results. And in one case, a couple of people published a piece in the Proceedings in National Academy of Sciences last year that they conducted some that I really liked that used generative models to programmatically generate out of memory like prompts. Anyway, we could talk about this a little bit later, but I think there's some interesting strategies that people are pursuing in this space, but it's really the Wild West at this point. And did you have a question?
I do have a question.
Great.
I don't know if now's the right
fair game for me. Yeah. Sorry, I'm being a little unfair. Anyways, I appreciate it.
I'm curious how much of this work focuses on the data that was used to train the LLM, because
almost none.
That seems extremely important for any kind of generalizability.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think a number of folks, and thinking about like this piece again, right? A number of folks, so Bale and Mike Frank, who I mentioned before, their pieces are separate. I don't mean to kind of conflate them, but they expressly advocate for using open source models in part because then the inputs can at least be audited more directly and you can try to understand biases. But
you need open source data.
You need open source data. Yeah. And I don't think, I think that these papers that have sort of raised the concerns about it mention that, but I don't think that they really, nobody's got a strong angle on that at this point. I'll come back to a piece of that in just a moment because I think there is some work that I find really inspiring in that direction. You're probably very familiar with it already, but I think a lot of the social science work is sort of taking at face value, okay, we've got a generative model, let's see how well it can do in replicating various kinds of human behavior for various kinds of samples, and try to understand the bias as of the output rather than the bias of the input. Because I think there's also some suggestive stuff, right? And here I'm thinking of some of Percy's work too, where it's like, it does seem that to me, right, as a total outsider to the field that's building the models, that there's some amount of like the scaling of the data input has produced performance sort of beyond a lot of people's expectations. So it may be that the model doesn't need that much data from, a very kind of what in survey research you would call a sort of like sparsely populated cell, right? Like the idea that like you have some constellation of attributes of a person that may be hard to find in the regular population. Like if I randomly selected 2,000 people from the US population, I would never find someone with, combination of characteristic A, B, and C. But my regression model, if I'm a social scientist using survey data, will still produce a prediction for a person with attributes A, B, and C, even if there was nobody like that in my data set. And it may be that that LLMs can produce a prediction that's a lot better than my 2,000 person sample-based prediction. But the jury's still out, I think. And I don't think it's an active concern that people have figured out a good angle on. Is that good to keep moving? Cool. Yeah, cool. No, I just didn't want to foreclose further follow-up, but we can follow up more. Okay, so I've said that of the existing studies that I'm aware of, at least, there are a number of them that take sort of admirable steps to try to embrace good standards of reproducible research that have emerged across the social sciences in the last 20 or 30 years. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. The thing is that the reasons they're doing this are because of what social scientists have learned about the problems that emerge in your research fields if you don't do so, right? And for those of you who've heard about things like replication crisis or reproducibility crisis in social sciences, that's what I'm talking about, right? So this is a paper published back in 2005 by, I'm not going to pronounce the author's last name correctly for fear, they're here at the Stanford Medical School, so I'm embarrassed to get it wrong. But John Ioannidis, somebody can help me out if you know in the audience, but apologies if he watches the YouTube video. But this was published in 2005, sort of staking a pretty bleak but blunt claim that most research findings, and this was about medical sciences and sort of social sciences, were false, and it enumerated a number of problems that he argued were causing this, including things like the bias of journals in the sciences to publish big, spectacular, splashy findings, various kinds of statistical procedures that people were using that were not resulting in robust results, and a lack of disclosure of replication materials so that procedures could be repeated, so that analysis could be replicated. Basically, these were, I would sort of categorize these as all kind of breakdowns in broadly the kind of culture of research integrity that the social sciences had cultivated up to that time. And I think there have been a number of really great steps to change that since then. But the extreme parallel take here would be something like, okay, if this was a problem or is a problem for a lot of the empirical behavioral and social sciences, since that we got worried about starting in the early 2000s, here we stand at the precipice of a novel field of, AI simulated social and behavioral science. Are we about to just kind of repeat the same problem all over again, just in new ways, right? How can we make LLM simulated social and behavioral studies at least as trustworthy, right? At least as reliable, aspire to the same kinds of or analogous kinds of integrity standards that we want kind of behavioral science studies to aspire to. Whoops, wrong direction. And so that's the idea here. So, and I think that this is where I see this as like a kind of big, inspiring challenge, where on the social science side, this is about taking what we've learned from the failures of some of our, bad old ways of doing stuff, and mapping it into this new space. And on an HCI and human-centered AI side, this is about supporting a specific kind of use case that may have broad implications for, design, policy, and scaling up certain kinds of research fields that that are still learning how to use these systems, right? So it's a particular kind of use case. And I think that the first step that I want to pursue that I'm talking about in the work we've got to present today is about assessing sort of the kinds of threats that may be distinct in the context of reproducing social science with AI models, right? And I want to just acknowledge a few of the things that have inspired the approach we're taking, and I'll try to move through these very quickly because I think they're fun to put up on the wall, but not core to the results I want to talk about. Right, there have been a lot of prior work, and I mentioned some of these, trying to estimate bias and sampling problems in other kinds of new research settings, right? I mentioned Mechanical Turk and crowdsourcing work. This is a paper that Esther Hargitay and I worked on a few years ago, but Jeremy Fries here in the sociology department did a lot of great work in this space, and others as well. Right, so this is about trying to understand what the kind of biases and variations in one setting might be that might shape the kinds of findings you get when you try to conduct social scientific analysis with that sample and with that population. So I think there's some things that I'm trying to learn from that area of work in the past as well. Another area, and this sort of speaks to some of what I was talking about in my response to you, right, is Eileen Kaliskan and Arvind Narayanan's work and their collaborators, trying to understand the bias that go into the corpora that are used to train the models, right? So I think I find that really inspiring. I'm not kind of building on it here, but I think there are others like Jessica Holman and who's a colleague at Northwestern, who've also tried to understand the specific kinds of biases and errors that you get out of generative AI or ML systems, or that go into them, that might then have implications for end use cases down the track. And then there's the work, I mentioned that, crisis and replication crisis work. And I mentioned that a lot of work has been done to try to boost up social science and make it more robust, more replicable, more trustworthy. And some of that's been done by, this is a project that was pursued by a just massive group of collaborators where they, worked in large teams to, a large team of teams to replicate hundreds of prior social science studies, in this case from psychology, to really try to assess which findings were going to be, if you tried to rigorously reproduce them in different samples with, in different ways, would hold up over time. And last but not least, there's been some other work, and this involves another colleague, Matt Kay, who's at Northwestern, which takes an idea of, the idea that when you're doing statistical analysis on social scientific data, you're often making choices along the way, right? This is Andrew Gelman, a statistician at Columbia University, has talked about this as thinking about forking paths in research design. And in walking down those paths and choosing particular forks, there are sort of roads you are not traveling. And we might start to think about generating research outputs that can actually incorporate those alternative paths. And Gelman and then these folks talk about that as thinking about research multiverses, where you might have the final version of the study that you, the research scientist, like the best, but you might also be able to present to your readers at the same time in a kind of creative interactive visualization, which is what these folks built the system to do, right? What happens if I twiddle this knob this way in the way I design the analysis? What happens if I change the rule that I use to decide who's in or out of the study, right? So this is I find this a really compelling and exciting line of work that inspired some of Carolyn's and my work in the space. Okay, preamble, done. So what I want to do in this space, and what I've been working with Carolyn to do, is to try to think about specific kinds of, distinct types of LLM-driven threats to robust social scientific replications and simulations, and sort of design probes to assess the sensitivity of social scientific simulations to those threats, right? That's the core of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through both the kinds of threats that we've thought about so far and the kinds of probe designs that we've developed to try to address them, and then give you sort of a worked example to think about with some actual results and some graphs that are kind of fun. And then I'll talk a little bit about the implications that I see coming out from that exercise so far, and where I'm hoping we can go with the work next, and hopefully you'll have lots of great questions and ideas that can help me think about better ways to do it. Okay, so some types of LLM-specific threats that we wanted to that we've identified that I'm going to talk about in a minute. 3 is the magic number here. So First one is prompt sensitivity. This one's kind of glaring in a way for any time you interact with an LLM, is that you've got to tell it what, you've got to ask it for something. And there may be idiosyncrasies of how you produce that input or what goes into that input that may generate, particular kinds of responses. And for social scientists, right, this is analogous to, right, there's a positive spin on this, which is that really skillful people, right, prompt engineers, can design prompts that can elicit, like very carefully elicit exactly the kind of output from models that they want under certain circumstances. Well, for social science, if you want to be able to simulate social and human behavior, that's fine, except that we still want to know which kinds of simulations are very sensitive to the details of the prompts that you're giving the model. Right, in psychology, I was talking to Rob Willer yesterday. In psychology, there's this idea of stimulus hacking, which is very analogous here that he was telling me about, where for psychology research, there might be people's studies that only work because they're a very creative research designer who produces a sort of experimental setup that elicits exactly the kind of response to a particular stimulus that they are hoping to find, right? And when you actually vary the stimulus a little bit, maybe the result never holds up, and it turns out that's not a sort of general pattern of human psychology or human behavior, but it was just this particular researcher being really good at designing that particular study, right? So this is the analogous thing here. The second one is stochasticity. Right, and there's a way that generative models, and again, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in the architecture or the construction of them, but right, we can think about, there are lots of points in these models where there is stochasticity and randomness inserted for very good reason. And some of that is incredibly valuable because it contributes both to the model's ability to explore and, produce sort of interesting and diverse kind of predictions of responses from across its training data, and to produce responses that vary a little bit and maybe embrace some of the idiosyncrasies of human behavior in ways that aren't so mechanistic that you might see from other kinds of modeling. So these can manifest in things like the model hyperparameters that you might be familiar with if you've interacted with ChatGPT or the APIs from OpenAI, where you can sort of say, I want this to be more deterministic or more random, right? You can dial that knob. But that's a great example of a thing where if I'm trying to reproduce a social scientific output, it might be helpful to understand how sensitive are my results to dialing that knob up or down. And another one is memorization, right? And so this goes back to the training data kind of issue. A lot of the thing that we do in the social sciences when we want to replicate or test something is we grab a really, brilliantly executed study from off the shelf that others have tested a few different times, and then we run it in a new context or with a new sample or something like that. That's all fine and well, except that a lot of those studies in some way, shape, or form may be in the training data. And so when you're prompting a generative model to sort of reproduce a social behavioral study, you might just be producing artifacts of training data in a sense, right? And it's hard to assess this for all the reasons that it can be hard to figure out if models are, what part of the training data models may be drawing on to generate a particular result. It can be hard to figure out if they're actually kind of aware of a prior finding. But it's a challenge because if you're benchmarking the performance of the model on something that's already part of its training data, you've kind of you're in a world where your testing is not very rigorous in a certain sense. Okay, so those are some of our problems. And now I want to talk about the kind of sensitivity probes that we've designed to try to evaluate them. So far we've got 3, and I'll talk about them in a little bit more depth in a sec. But, right, and they don't correspond exactly to the 3 problems that I laid out. So I just don't want to create the illusion that okay, we had 3 problems, we have 3 fixes, and each fix corresponds to 1 problem. That's not what I'm doing here. These are more sort of flexible and adaptable things, but I see them as kind of categories or types of techniques that you might use to probe the sensitivity of a model result in this case, right? They're not meant to be comprehensive. And the worked example that I'm going to show you is only really going to talk about one of them, the first one, perturbation. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. But I think that they have some interesting strengths and possibilities. So I want to talk about each of them a little bit. So perturbation, what do I mean by this? I mean introduce systematically varying prompts and settings to just sort of try fiddling with the knobs a little bit, so that if you're trying to replicate a particular behavioral study or a particular behavioral pattern, you can assess how sensitive the result is to the particulars of the way that you set up the replication or the simulation, right? So, right, and I've got a few different dimensions that I think, oops, and a spare semicolon over there. Thanks, LaTeX. But I got a few different dimensions that you might think about this in. So one has to do with the study protocol, right? Like I talked a minute ago about this idea that there might be stimulus hacking. But there may be elements of study designs that we can actually expand or sort of explode, because we're just simulating this. We can simulate it a lot of different ways. And it may be that that can help us understand, for example, whether a particular finding is just an artifact of something having been in the training data, of the model having memorized it already. Right. Other things include the particular language that we use for the prompt, right? So as social scientists, we like to pretend that the particular way that a study was conducted or was designed, is like somehow sacred, right? So you take these like classic research designs, like a prisoner's dilemma or something like that, and you try to find a canonically worded version of it that you can use in your study. And you do that partly because you don't want to have to convince peer reviewers that you wrote something new and that you changed something important about the original study design. But you also do that because if it worked in one setting, part of what you're trying to do is see whether it works in a new setting. But, that, again, right, there's lots of reasons why we might want to, trivially or sort of subtly alter the phrasing to see how models respond when they're conducting simulations of human behavior. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Other things are things like the settings. So I talked about hyperparameters, the temperature of the model. You can format your input and request the format of your output in different ways from generative language models. And when you're prompting it, we've found some evidence that even asking the model to output things in a structured data format like JSON produces pretty different results than just asking it to output stuff in more natural language. So you can get creative in this one. You can add white spaces, new line characters, change digits, numbers represented as digits into numbers represented as words or fractions or whatever you like. So exploring the effects of that. And then there's different prompting strategies that we might pursue, right? And this ranges from the kind of mundane, right, like asking the model to, explain its reasoning when it gives you an answer, right, the chain of thought prompting approach, to also doing things that are more sophisticated, like feeding it a bunch of demographic background information about your hypothetical simulated study participant to see if it generates more accurate outputs once you've done that, right? Or feeding it a memory stream in the case of a generative agent. And then there's model version, right? I mentioned a minute ago that some of the prior work in this space was done on earlier versions of ChatGPT. We can never find out if the initial results are replicable in some sense because we can't go back and use a deprecated version of the model. But there are multiple model versions available at any given time. So we can assess, right, whether our simulated result is robust across model versions, or at least sort of model generations, right, or something like that. Or, within a single generation, there may be multiple versions, right? A new version of the GPT AI, the API was just released earlier this week or last week. And so we can see whether the one from last week produces similar kinds of outputs to the one from 2 months ago. Okay. So the other two that I've got, and I'll spend a little less time on these because I'm not going to have results about them yet, but is to iterate, right? There's a basic idea in statistics where part of the reason why you want to replicate a study design that was conducted over here over here is that by drawing multiple samples, you're actually generating what you would talk about as a sampling distribution. And so having those multiple draws, right, especially when you're dealing with a sort of hidden population, right? In this case, the hidden population is not a group of people who don't want to be identified. The hidden population is a theoretical sort of space of possible responses to a given set of prompts that we can't observe directly, right? So by drawing like multiple iterations of responses to the same queries or to similar queries, we can construct a sampling distribution and like try to understand the sort of distributional characteristics of the, what kinds of estimates we get from that, from a single draw from that sampling distribution. And then the other one is to re-replicate, right? So this is our third kind of probe technique, where I mentioned that there's been a lot of work like that in that reproducibility project, that open science project, to replicate existing social scientific research with additional social science, with additional populations of people or samples of people. Well, let's replicate the replications, right? I mean, again, the nice thing about generative model simulations is that all they cost you is sort of API tokens. And there's a lot of kind of off-the-shelf tools that social scientists have built to conduct these kind of meta-analytic comparisons where you're comparing the results of many experiments and assessing whether those kind of the population of many replicated experiments produces a finding consistent with initial studies or something like that. Yes?
Just make sure I'm following. Is it iterate or re-replicate that's basically do Monte Carlo sampling, like run the simulation a bunch of times?
I think that there's overlap, and I think it's because re-replicating, to me, it makes the most sense when you iterate with it. I mean, we do have a result that is a case where you could imagine performing just one replication, right, of a replication. So let's say, and I'll get to this in a moment, but like let's say I've got a classic social science study that was done in a lab. It's been replicated really carefully, in another sample. I can run one simulated replication of the replication of the original study, right? I can use the same techniques, the same measurement, and draw one replicant sample. Or I can do that 1,000 times or 100 times or whatever, right? So to me, that first step of drawing one would be a re-replication. And when I draw 1,000 of those, that would be an iterated re-replication, right? So that would be iteration and replication.
Iteration doesn't imply variation?
Not necessarily. I think that's how I'm thinking about it now. Okay. Maybe it should. I don't know. I think you can also combine perturbation with iteration, right? So I mean, it gets really confusing when you start crossing these over. So like I could, let's work with the model temperature, right? Which is this kind of randomness thing I can, tune as a hyperparameter in the OpenAI, API. You could imagine a scenario where I spin that up to maximum randomness, and then I draw 1,000 samples at maximum randomness. I draw 1,000 samples at, middle randomness, and 1,000 samples at the most deterministic randomness, right? So that would be a case where I've done like perturbation and iteration to try to understand the sampling distribution of perturbed results.
Yeah. Maybe a related question. Is there a difference between replicating the replication and replicating the original stuff?
I think that there's a difference insofar as social scientists would treat the results of a study that has replicated differently.
So you're saying that it's a replication that is like
worked.
Positive,
Maybe not. Yeah, maybe you're right. That's in some ways, no. I think that social scientists treat these kind of like meta-analysis and meta-analytic analyses of study replications are published as distinct artifacts in the social sciences. So in that sense, they're different. I think mechanically, like what it looks like in terms of conducting the study, probably not terribly different, although there are many reasons why once you've got an initial finding or an initial set of studies that demonstrate a finding, you may construct a replication differently. Because you know something, for example, about the expected effect size, you can make a power calculation say like, okay, if I'm expecting an effect of at least this size, I want to design my study to be able to detect something of at least that size. That means I need this many participants in my study. And so the replications often have slightly different structures.
So is re-replication a common thing in social science also?
No.
Like it seems like it.
There's a lot of replication and there's a lot of meta-analysis, but I haven't seen, there's not as much, I haven't seen re-replication as like a thing in the social sciences. Oftentimes, if you, at this point, people are still working in the mode of like, let's get enough replications going first, and then we'll like, worry about what happens after that next.
Does a replication imply that there has to be variation? So if Manisha's lab publishes a result, when I replicate, typically I'm replicating with my sample in my lab or something like that. Whereas if I think about like Manisha's lab publishes a simulation, I just take the code, I run essentially the exact same thing. So analytically, I'm trying to.
Yeah. I think that there are.
It's like I ran your software.
I think that is a distinct component of replications. Is that I think replication. It's hard for me to imagine a replication where a re-replication where you would fundamentally alter the study protocol, for example. That's not really a thing. It makes it a little harder to imagine. So I talked a little bit about how re-replication could be combined with iteration. It makes it a little harder for me to imagine re-replication being combined with some of the perturbation strategies that I talked about a moment ago.
Because then if it fails, you don't know.
You're like, well, who knows why, right? I mean, there's kind of a. So I think conceptually they're distinct. I think that there's, but as you can tell from my response, I don't think I have like, there's no, I'm kind of making this stuff up. So let's see what we can do with it. But I think it's interesting to play with, and I think those are exactly the kinds of questions that I would hope could be asked with an approach like this. Okay, so let's go through the partially worked example because this is, I think, the most fun part. Just see if I had anything. No? Okay, great. So I'm doing this with just one study. Carolyn and I did this with just one study for now, right? And we chose this study, which was published in 2014 in Science. An experiment that's been published in Science in the social sciences is generally treated as like, it's probably done really, really well. And indeed, this one is no exception. So this is a study led by Uri Gnisi, UC San Diego, with some collaborators about overhead aversion in donations to charities, right? So the basic idea, the basic finding from this study, it asks people, brings people into a lab. There are two studies in the project. This is the lab portion of the project. So there's one study that's a lab experiment. They bring people into the lab and they say, Michael, you have the choice. We've got two charities. You have $100 that you can decide where it goes. You have to pick one charity. Charity A does lots of nice, good things and has no overhead. So all of your donation will go directly to the sort of like the cause and will not support overhead. Charity B does really great, nice things. And for some of the study, they randomly decide that it's going to have no overhead. And for some of the study, they say it's going to have a little overhead. And for some of the study, they say it's going to have 50% overhead, quite a bit of overhead. Right? And it turns out.
Try 60. It's a little closer to what we got here.
Thanks, universities. Right. So what they find is that people are less excited to donate when there's high overhead, right? That's the overhead aversion component. That's not novel or surprising. And they find that they do some manipulations where they find that basically telling people that, somebody else out there, some beneficent donor has covered the overhead so that 100% of your donation, Michael, will go to support the good works and not to pay the staff of the organization. That makes it so that you are now willing to donate to that organization again, right, at a higher rate, right? So I'll show you the graph in a moment. Well, here, let's do it now. So here's the the sort of figure one, the kind of top line finding from this lab study, right? And what you can see is in the study they have 5 conditions. Each condition produces one of these little points. So they have 0 overhead, where they just see who donates to, right? In this case, there was one charity that was more famous than the other, and they did that on purpose. Right, because that was part of how they indexed how overhead was affecting whether people would or wouldn't donate. Otherwise, it might be just a random choice. Right, so when there's no overhead for either organization, most of the people in the study donate to the more famous charity. When you have a little bit of overhead, that doesn't change much. this is where the overhead is not covered by somebody else, right? And then when you have a lot of overhead, you can see that having that overhead covered by somebody, by a beneficent other donor, makes a big impact on the proportion of people who are going to donate to the more famous charity, right? So the overhead aversion component of it is sort of the difference between these two dots, right? Where you see, like, if I cover the overhead, people will keep donating to the more famous charity, versus if I don't cover the overhead, people will donate to the charity with less overhead more often. Okay? For our perturbation examples, we are only focused on the overhead not being covered. We wanted to see if there was overhead aversion, right? We wanted to see if we could reproduce overhead aversion by prompting LLMs. So it's these three dots, basically. This one with 0 overhead, and then the overhead not being covered, those conditions there. Okay. This was also a study that was replicated very well a few years later, so we have access to the replication in addition, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so for us, study one, which is basically the only study we've done so far, is to just try to do some simulations to replicate overhead aversion and use some of those kind of sensitivity probing strategies I talked about a moment ago. So here's our first one where we start off like, let's just see what happens when we try to take the protocol and prompt the model sort of with no further information, just run the model through the exact same thing that the researchers did with the people who came into their lab. And so you might recall these three dots, right, that I was talking about, 0, 5, and 50% overhead. That's what you've got right here. So what we find, lo and behold, is that at low amounts of overhead, the model, the simulated people are still willing to, the model is still willing to donate to the more famous charity. And at about 50%, it falls off very steeply to 0, right? Nobody is willing to give anything to that organization anymore. So it's a bit extreme. Maybe this, I don't know, like the question I want you to start putting into your head is like, do you find this compelling, right? Do you think this is a compelling replication now? That's the question we were trying to ask with this. So with this first one, when I saw this, I was like, oh, okay, it looks like it's showing some amount of overhead aversion. Boy, does the model seem averse to overhead, right? But maybe a little too averse to overhead. Maybe it's disappointing. I don't know.
Well, it's also under-averse on the left half.
Yeah. So the corresponding place in the original graph where this would have been was around like 75%, I think, for 0 and 5% overhead. And then for the 50% overhead, it dropped to just below 50% choosing that charity.
It's clout chasing, overhead coverage.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. So the next thing we did is we said, well, why settle for just 3 overhead levels when you could have 12 or 13? So we filled in the distribution because we wanted to see what the model would do. And this is just one set of settings for otherwise. But now we can sort of see the whole space a little bit more. We can see the descent along the proportion donating. There's a couple things I notice here. One is this little bump out around 55%, which in another version that we did of this with an earlier version of the model was actually quite large and made us worried that maybe the model had memorized the empirical finding when we saw it. And the other are these funny sort of anomalous dips, but maybe that's just random noise. We didn't really know, right? But again, before I take a question, I want you to ask yourself, do you think the model is replicating overhead aversion, right, in this case? I'm not sure. It seems that now I can see the descent a bit more. I can see how it's moving through space. My answer was that I was a little bit comforted by this because at least it's getting the idea that at some intermediate level of overhead, people are less willing to donate to the charity, right? So it's moving through the distribution in some meaningful way, or a way to which I might ascribe meaning as someone interested in whether this aligns with human behavior. You have a question?
I did, yeah. So how was the question asked?
I'm going to get to that in a moment. Yeah. So we just used the exact same protocol that the researchers used with the people they brought into the lab.
Right, but it's sort of odd that the y-axis is labeled choosing water.
Oh, sorry. I'll show you in a moment. But it's the proportion of people choosing to donate to the more famous charity given a certain level of overhead, right? So the conditional on that charity charging a certain amount to support their staff and operations, right? How many people are willing to, what percentage of the sample is willing to donate to that more famous charity versus the less famous charity that has no overhead. So that's why it's calculated as a percentage. Sorry.
But then how's it a numeric thing? Like you ask the model once and it's a yes or no. So here you go, like people, you take the average over the binary versus here it's a single model saying yes or no.
It's a single model, but we're prompting it 100 times.
I see.
Like at each dot is 100 prompts. Sorry, I should have been clear about that. Thanks for asking that. All right. So now we're going to get into some fun stuff where we actually varied the prompt. So this is the prompt. I should have shown you this first, but I'm showing it to you here because I'm going to mix it up in a little bit. We're a little short on time, so I don't want to read the whole thing out loud. But what you can see is that it's basically saying, here's the setup. We're going to ask you to pick between one of these two charities. We're going to tell you a little bit about each charity. And in telling you about each charity, right, what's going on in this second paragraph that's worth pointing at is that I've got our variables in here. But we are randomly assigning an overhead level to this second charity, right? So that's where the manipulation comes in. And the prompt clarifies that, given this overhead level, this amount or percentage of your donation will go directly to support the work versus this amount will go to cover the costs of the organization, right? And this is the original, this is pulled from their replication materials, from the original study. So LLMs are great at summarizing or restating text, so we asked the LLMs to give us a handful of alternate versions. This is one of the alternate versions. It's a little shorter, but I read through it, and as someone who spends a lot of time writing and thinking about communicating ideas, I had quibbles with some of the wording, but I came away feeling pretty good about this because it basically conveys the same meaning and the same setup. And it alters some things that are pretty small, right? This one, instead of being, right, the original said, so for every $1 you donate, this many cents will go to the operations and this many cents will go to the staff. This one, it says it as a percentage, right? So it's making some of those minor changes that I talked about. So like I said, we ran 5 of those, and the results sort of splay out all over the place all of a sudden in a way that's kind of fun. So again, each of these dots corresponds to 100 queries. We submitted the prompt 100 times. This is the result that we get. So that one that I showed you was actually prompt number 5. So that one produces a very steep descent relatively early in the overhead level distribution, but actually starts out at something more like the empirically observed level. Here's one where we fiddled with the temperature settings, right? Far less variation was produced with this one, but still some interesting variation, right? I think, this prediction up here is quite different from this prediction up here. So depending on which setting you choose, you go down the gradient at a different rate in a different place.
For the previous
graphs,
what temperature were they set?
Oh, sorry. The range is interval, it goes from 0 to 1.
But the previous graph you showed us.
Oh, yeah. So the default, we were just using the recommendation from OpenAI is usually to use 1 these days. Okay. So we were just going with 1 as the first one. So so the initial graph, the initial figure I showed you where we just ran the prompt across the entire distribution of overhead levels should correspond to the brown line here. And apologies for the not accessible color palette we're working on. Here's one where we asked it to give us the format the output as JSON. And again, we layered this with temperature variation as well, so you get kind of like a 2-for-1 here. Asking it to output as JSON, you can see it moves everything, again, further to the left and makes the descent steeper. Kind of interesting.
People will also get more frustrated if you make them write JSON.
Yeah, I think that's right. So nobody wants to, the model doesn't want to donate to this charity if you ask it to write JSON. I don't know. This one was pretty fun where we ran it through 4 different versions of the model, right? So the newest one, 4.0, is the red. And here again, apologies for the inaccessible color palette. You can see that the oldest version, in some sense, performs quite differently. than GPT-4 versions, right? This is 3.5 turbo, right? So anyway, I think, well here, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to skip this. I can tell you about it later if you want. We replicated the replication. It kind of replicated, but we just did it once so far. So we'll see what comes of that. Overall, I would say that from this, my takeaway is that the patterns are kind of, like if you squint, they resemble the original, right? Which is nice. And I think that's part of what's exciting to social scientists in this field about the potential of AI-based simulation of social scientific work. On the other hand, the point estimates are pretty bad, right? And by point estimates, I mean like the actual values, which replicate very well in human populations, by the way, human samples. But the model turns out to be quite extreme and to move through the distribution of outputs in quite a different way than people do. And on top of that, perturbing various aspects of the prompting and the settings and those other features I talked about produces quite substantial variations, right? So we can move the distribution, right? In this case, we've got this nice kind of logistic-looking curve. We can move it around. We can change the steepness. We can do lots of things to it just by fiddling the knobs. And I don't know, at the end of the day, does this mean that I should treat this as a reliable replication? Or is this a good simulation, right? Did this work? I think that's a complicated question. But I think that what it suggested, to me at least at this point, is that the strategy of sort of probing it and exploring the space of settings can reveal things about how sensitive these results are and can help us understand what kinds of social scientific findings may or may not be worth pursuing further. So in terms of what's next, we've got a bunch of stuff to sort of complete our initial strategy with this and evaluate a bunch of other pieces of it. But we're at time, so I'm going to wrap it up there. And if we have to shut it down, I'm happy to hang around and talk with folks, address more questions, or chat more afterwards. So thank you very much.